I wanted to see if I could automate virtual machine deployments. I've set a few rules. No pressure. All right, we've bound 2 of the workflow's inputs, but there are a whole bunch more. And there's an output that we need to bind. So let's get started. All right, I'm going to continue this process. Next up is VM folder. So first question I'm going to ask myself is, do I want the user to be able to pick the VM folder, or am I, the workflow developer, going to pick the VM folder? If I want the user to pick the VM folder, I'll create an input. If I want me, the Orchestrator workflow developer, to pick the VM folder, I'm going to create a variable. Well, in this case here, I want to set the value. So I'm going to create a variable. So we'll click Select Variable, and we'll create a new variable. And notice, by the way, it's the same interface that we saw before. Again, I'm going to say variable because I want to pick the value. I could go with the default name. The name that you see here is the name that the other workflow calls this thing. But my name and its name do not have to match. And that's totally fine. Let me fill out some more here. And again, we can see the type of this variable is automatically set for us. It's a VC:VM folder. So again, this is an object type defined by the vCenter plugin. Now, to pick the value, to pick the VM folder, I can either do something similar to what I did before. In the previous variable, I just typed what I was looking for. So for example, I could type my VM folder. I could type the whole name, or as you can see here, I just typed my, I could pick that. But I'd like to introduce you to the tree picker. The tree picker brings up an interface that looks like this. So this tree picker, it's going to look more like a tree picker once I start expanding things here, is allowing me to go into the vCenter inventory to find whatever it is I'm looking for. What am I looking for? I'm looking for a virtual machine folder, so let's go find one. By the way, as you go into this inventory, notice that these 3 folders here correspond to the different views that you know and love from the vSphere client. So we've got host and clusters view, VMs and templates, data stores and networking, and over in Orchestrator, when we're looking at the inventory through Orchestrator, we can see the same things. They look a little different, but it's the same host and clusters folder, VMs and templates folder, data stores, and networking. So if I'm picking a VM folder, which of those 4 do you think we should go into? Well, obviously, we're going to go into VM. And notice that it's showing us all these choices, including the one that we're going to choose here, which is the VM folder that we created a few moments ago. So I'm going to go ahead and choose my VM folder. I'll select it, and I'm done creating this new variable. Now I'm going to continue this process for all of these other inputs of that workflow, and I'm going to go through the same basic process. The first question is always, do you want to create an input that allows the end user to set the value, or are you going to create a variable which allows the workflow developer to pick the value? So let me go set up the rest of these inputs. I just ran into a problem. Notice I'm trying to set up the network that the new virtual machine is going to get plugged into. And we said that we're going to plug it into this production network, but notice it's not allowing me to select it. The reason why is that a VC:network is an object type that's for a standard virtual switch based network. This, on the other hand, is a network that resides on a distributed virtual switch. So we have a mismatch here. Now, my rules for this little challenge I'm doing don't say that I have to plug the machine into a network. So tell you what, why don't we bypass that? There are ways of plugging machines into networks, but I'm just going to say, let's not bother with a network. We'll say none, and we'll click select. We'll create that variable. And again, if I scroll down here, you can see I've got a bit more work here. Let me set up the last 2 inputs. And just like that, I've got all the inputs that we need to supply to the other workflow. Now, similarly, we also need to capture any outputs of that workflow. It's essentially the same process. So that other workflow has an output that it calls new VM. I'm going to create in my workflow a variable to hold the value of the new VM. So let's go ahead and click select variable, create new. Say this is new virtual machine. We'll type a description. And in this case here, we're not going to set the value of this variable because we're going to allow the workflow to set the value of this variable. Let's click create. And I have now set up all the inputs and all the outputs required by the other workflow. Again, that's a process known as parameter binding, and parameter binding is one of the most important things for you to learn when you start working with Orchestrator. Let's make certain you understand that these are inputs of the other workflow. On the other hand, these are your workflow inputs and or outputs and or variables. All right, so we had to do a bit of parameter binding, but we haven't written any code at all. So let's see if our workflow is valid. Looks like the validation is successful. We'll go ahead and save it since it's valid. And why don't we go ahead and try running it? So let's save it. And we'll click run to run this workflow. Okie doke. We have set up the bindings for all of our inputs. We did an outward binding for our output. And now we're ready to run our Orchestrator workflow. Join me in the next video and we'll let her rip.